The sky over central Oklahoma had that look, that heavy, pregnant, greenish-gray look that people in the plains know all too well. It was the afternoon of May 31st, 2013, and the air was thick with moisture and tension. It was the kind of day when the wind doesn't just blow. It waits. It holds its breath. And if you have ever lived in tornado country, you know exactly what that feeling is like. The humidity clings to your skin like a second layer, and the silence between gusts feels louder than any siren. In Reno, Oklahoma, a small town just west of Oklahoma City, people were going about their Saturday. They were buying groceries, filling up gas tanks, mowing lawns. They had no idea that before the sun went down, they would witness something that had never been seen before on this planet. Something that would break records and haunt the nightmares of everyone who saw it. The Storm Prediction Center had been watching this setup for days. All the ingredients were there. A powerful jet stream digging across the Rockies. Warm, moist air flowing north from the Gulf of Mexico. And a dry line, that invisible boundary between wet and dry air that was going to act like a match struck against a strip of sandpaper. The forecasters knew something big was possible, but even they did not know how big. They issued a moderate risk for severe storms that morning, which is a serious warning but not the highest level. The highest level is a high risk, and that would have been appropriate. But the truth is, no one could have predicted what was about to happen. The atmosphere over Oklahoma that day was not just unstable. It was volatile, it was angry. It was loaded with more energy than 1,000 freight trains running at full speed. The first storms began to fire up in the early afternoon. They were scattered at first, like soldiers taking their positions before a battle, but as the hours passed, they began to organize. They began to rotate. And by late afternoon, one storm in particular had caught the attention of every storm chaser in the region. It was near the town of Hinton, about 40 miles west of Oklahoma City, and it was already showing signs of becoming something special. The rotation on radar was tightening, the updraft was strengthening. And the storm was moving. It was moving fast, much faster than a typical tornado-producing storm. This storm was tracking to the east at around 50 miles per hour, which meant that anything it produced would be moving at highway speeds. There would be no time to run, there would be no time to hide, there would only be time to react. The storm chasers began to converge, hundreds of them, professionals like Reed Timmer, Tim Samaras, and Mike Betts, amateurs with cameras mounted on their dashboards. Scientists from the National Severe Storms Laboratory, they all knew this was the day. They all felt it in their bones. The sky was doing something strange. The clouds were low and ragged and the light was wrong. It was too yellow, too orange, too surreal. And then at around 6 p.m. the first funnel appeared. It was a thin, rope-like tornado that touched down near the town of Union City. It seemed harmless at first, almost graceful. But you do not judge a tornado by its appearance in the first few minutes. You wait. And everyone who was watching that day was waiting for something bigger. The big show was about to begin about 6 miles south of Reno. The storm had dropped a second tornado, and this one was not a rope. This one was a wedge. The wedge tornado is the holy grail of storm chasers. It is the most photogenic, the most violent, and the most terrifying form a tornado can take. When a wedge tornado forms, it does not look like a funnel anymore. It looks like a wall, a solid wall of cloud connecting the sky to the earth. It looks like the end of the world compressed into a 3-mile-wide column of pure destruction. And that is exactly what happened at Reno. The tornado grew and grew and grew. It did not stop growing until it reached a width of 2.6 miles. To put that into perspective, that is wider than the distance between the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center. That is wider than the entire island of Manhattan from the Hudson River to the East River. That is wider than anything anyone had ever measured before. The Reno Tornado became the widest tornado ever recorded. But here is the thing about the Reno Tornado that most people do not know. It was not just wide, it was not just big. It was a liar, it was a trickster. It was a shapeshifter that refused to follow the rules. Most tornadoes move from southwest to northeast. Most tornadoes have a clear, well-defined edge. Most tornadoes are easy to see from a distance because they are dark and obvious against the sky. The Reno Tornado was none of those things. It moved erratically. It jogged left, it jogged right, it stalled, it accelerated, it changed direction without warning, and it was wrapped in rain. Not just rain, but a curtain of precipitation so thick that you could not see the tornado until it was right on top of you. This is called a rain-wrapped tornado, and it is the most dangerous kind because it gives you no visual warning. You do not see it coming, you only hear it, and by the time you hear it, it is already too late. The storm chasers on the ground that day were some of the most experienced in the world. They had seen hundreds of tornadoes. They had driven into the core of supercells. They had survived close calls that would have killed anyone else. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for the Reno Tornado. Reed Timmer, the famous storm chaser from the show Storm Chasers, was in his armored vehicle called the Dominator. He was positioned to the south of the tornado, thinking he was in a safe spot. But the tornado did something unexpected. It turned south. It turned directly toward him. He had to floor it to get away, and even then he barely escaped. The tornado was moving at speeds of over 50 miles per hour at times, and it was changing direction so quickly that even the best chasers were caught off guard. Then there was Tim Samaras. Tim was not just a storm chaser. He was a scientist. He was a pioneer. He had spent his entire career studying tornadoes, trying to understand them, trying to measure them, trying to predict them. He had developed instruments called probes that could be placed directly in the path of a tornado to measure wind speed and pressure. He had survived countless close encounters. He knew tornadoes better than almost anyone alive. And on May 31st, 2013, Tim Samaras was on the ground near El Reno with his son Paul and his colleague Carl Young. They were in a car trying to get into position. They were experienced. They were careful. They knew the risks. But the El Reno tornado did not care about experience. It did not care about carefulness. It did not care about the risks. It was something new, something different, something that had never been seen before, and it took them, all three of them. Tim Samaras, his son Paul, and Carl Young were killed by the El Reno tornado. They were the first storm chasers to die in the line of duty in over a decade. Their deaths sent shockwaves through the entire community. If Tim Samaras could be killed, no one was safe. The tragedy of Tim Samaras and his team was not the only tragedy that day. There was also the death of Richard Henderson, a retired firefighter who was driving home from a wedding with his wife and daughter. They were caught in the tornado on Interstate 40. Richard died trying to protect his family, and there was also the death of Dan Robinson, a storm chaser from Mississippi who was killed when his vehicle was swept off the road. In total, 8 people died that day. 8 lives that were taken by a tornado that did not just break records, it broke rules. It broke expectations. It broke the very definition of what a tornado could be. But the story of the El Reno tornado is not just a story of death and destruction. It is also a story of survival. It is a story of people who faced something that should have killed them and lived to tell about it. Take Mike Betts, the Weather Channel storm chaser. He and his crew were in a chase vehicle when the tornado caught them. They were literally inside the tornado. Their vehicle was thrown into the air, rolled multiple times, and slammed back down into a field. Mike and his cameraman were injured, but they survived. They survived because they were wearing seatbelts. They survived because they were in a vehicle that was built to withstand impact. They survived because they were lucky, and they knew it. They knew that if the tornado had been just a little bit stronger, or if they had been thrown just a little bit differently, they would have been added to the list of the dead. Then there were the people in El Reno itself. The town of El Reno has about 16,000 residents, and many of them were at home when the tornado hit. They had no storm cellar. They had no basement. Many of them had only a closet or a bathroom to hide in. And they survived. They survived because the tornado, as wide as it was moving so fast that it did not spend much time over any one spot. It was like a giant skipping stone. It touched down, scraped the earth, and moved on. The damage was severe, but it was not as catastrophic as it could have been. If the tornado had been slower or if it had stalled over a populated area, the death toll could have been in the hundreds. The people of El Reno were lucky, and they knew it. The aftermath of the El Reno tornado was a scene of utter chaos. Roads were blocked, power lines were down, houses were flattened, cars were tossed into trees. The National Weather Service sent out survey teams to assess the damage and determine the tornado's strength. They expected to find evidence of an EF5, the highest category on the enhanced Fujita scale, with winds over 200 miles per hour, but they did not. The damage was consistent with an EF3 with winds around 160 miles per hour. How could a tornado that was 2.6 miles wide not produce EF5 damage? The answer was simple. The tornado was moving so fast that it did not have time to destroy everything in its path. It was like a sledgehammer swinging at a wall while running past it. The sledgehammer hit the wall, but it did not stay in contact long enough to knock it down. The damage was scattered, inconsistent, and confusing. The survey teams had to rewrite their understanding of how tornadoes cause damage. The El Reno tornado had not just broken records, it had broken science. The wind speeds measured by mobile radar were staggering. The University of Oklahoma's ROX-ball radar measured winds of over 296 miles per hour in the subvortex of the tornado. That is close to 300 miles per hour. That is faster than a Formula One race car. That is faster than the speed of sound in some places. And it was happening just a few hundred feet above the ground. If those winds had reached the surface, the damage would have been unimaginable. But they did not. They stayed aloft, swirling in a vortex that defied explanation. The El Reno tornado was not just a tornado, it was a laboratory, it was a mystery. It was a message from the atmosphere that we still do not understand what we are dealing with. The storm chasers who survived that day came back changed. They had seen something that no human had ever seen before. They had looked into the heart of a monster and lived to tell the story. But the story was not easy to tell. It was not a story of triumph. It was a story of survival. It was a story of grief. It was a story of questions that have no answers. Why did the tornado behave the way it did? Why did it turn south when all the models said it should turn northeast? Why did it grow so wide? Why did it kill Tim Samaras and spare Mike Betts? These are questions that the storm-chasing community is still asking, and they may never get the answers. In the years since the Reno tornado, the science of tornado prediction has advanced. Doppler radar technology has improved, storm chasers have better equipment, the National Weather Service has better forecasting tools, but the Reno tornado remains a cautionary tale. It is a reminder that nature is not something we can control. It is not something we can predict with perfect accuracy. It is something we can only try to understand, and even that is a struggle. The Reno tornado was a once-in-a-lifetime event. It was the widest tornado ever recorded. It was the most deadly for storm chasers. It was a day that changed everything for everyone who experienced it. As the sun set on May 31st, 2013, the sky over Reno turned a deep shade of purple. The clouds were still churning, still swirling, still releasing their energy into the atmosphere. The sirens had stopped, the rain had let up, the wind had died down, but the silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of a battlefield after the fighting is over. It was the silence of people searching for their loved ones. It was the silence of a town trying to understand what had just happened to them. And in that silence, the only thing that remained was the memory of the widest tornado the world had ever seen. A tornado that had come and gone in a matter of hours but left a mark that would last forever. And in that silence, the only thing that remained was the memory of the widest tornado the world had ever seen. A tornado that had come and gone in a matter of hours but left a mark that would last forever. But what exactly did that mark look like? For the scientists who arrived in Reno in the days that followed, it was a landscape of contradictions. Houses that were completely destroyed sat next to houses that had barely a broken window. Trees that had been snapped in half stood beside trees that were still standing, their leaves rustling in the breeze. It was as if the tornado had picked and chosen its victims with a strange, unfathomable logic. And in that chaos, the researchers found clues. One of the most puzzling aspects of the Reno tornado was its behavior on the ground. Normally, a tornado of that size and intensity would carve a wide, continuous swath of destruction. But Reno left a debris trail that was fragmented, almost patchy. In some places, the ground was scoured clean as if a giant blowtorch had swept across it. In others, the grass was still green, the dirt untouched. The National Weather Service survey teams walked mile after mile, measuring damage, taking photographs, and trying to piece together what had happened. They used GPS devices to map the track of the tornado, and what they found was remarkable. The tornado had not just been wide, it had been erratic. It had wobbled, danced, and sometimes even seemed to stop and reverse direction. The radar data confirmed this. The mesocyclone, the rotating thunderstorm that spawned the tornado, had been cycling. It had been producing multiple vortices, some of which were satellite tornadoes that spun independently around the main funnel. One of those satellite tornadoes had been the one that killed Tim Samaras and his team. It had formed suddenly without warning and had been moving in a completely different direction from the parent storm. This was a wake-up call for the entire meteorological community. For decades, the conventional wisdom had been that tornadoes move in a predictable path, generally from southwest to northeast. But Reno had turned south, then east, then southeast, then back again. It had defied all the models, and in doing so, it had exposed a fundamental gap in our understanding of how tornadoes interact with their environment. The storm that produced Reno was what meteorologists call a high precipitation supercell, or HP supercell. These storms are famous for being rain-wrapped, meaning that the tornado is often hidden behind a curtain of heavy rain. Chasers and spotters cannot see it until it is almost on top of them, and that is exactly what happened on May 31st. The tornado was invisible to the naked eye for most of its life. It was only detected by radar, and even then the radar beam was scanning at an angle that missed the near-ground winds. The deadliest part of the tornado was happening in the blind spot of our technology. In the weeks and months after the disaster, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, convened a special review panel. They brought in experts from across the country to analyze the data and to recommend changes. One of the key findings was that the tornado warning system had failed. The National Weather Service had issued a tornado warning for Reno more than 20 minutes before the tornado struck. But the warning was based on the assumption that the storm would continue moving northeast. When the storm turned south, the warning area became irrelevant. People in the path of the tornado did not realize they were in danger. The storm chasers who were killed had actually been south of the storm, waiting for it to pass. But the tornado came to them instead. The review panel recommended that future warnings include more explicit language about the possibility of sudden changes in direction, and that emergency managers should not rely solely on radar projections for evacuations. But the most profound changes came in the storm-chasing community itself. The death of Tim Samaras sent shockwaves that rippled through every chaser who had ever looked at a storm with wonder. Tim was not just a chaser, he was a legend. He had appeared on television, in documentaries, and in the pages of National Geographic. He had invented instruments that measured the inside of tornadoes. He had survived close calls that would have killed anyone else. And yet, on May 31st, 2013, he made a split-second decision that cost him his life. The exact circumstances of his death are still debated. What is known is that he, his son Paul, and Carl Young were in a 2007 Chevrolet Cobalt, driving on a dirt road south of El Reno. They were trying to get into position to deploy a probe. The tornado was moving toward them, but they believed they were safe because they were south of the main circulation. But the tornado spawned a satellite vortex that moved rapidly to the south and east, catching them on a road that offered no escape. They were thrown from the car. They did not survive. The autopsy reports later revealed that Tim Samaras died from blunt force trauma, but the real cause of death, the one that the storm-chasing community grappled with, was a failure of perception. They had misjudged the storm, they had been caught off guard, and that could happen to anyone. In the aftermath, many chasers reevaluated their own safety practices. Some quit altogether. Others started carrying life insurance and writing wills before each tornado season. Chaser conventions began, including dedicated sessions on safety and risk assessment. The idea that a tornado could be outrun or outsmarted was shattered. El Reno had taught a brutal lesson. No matter how much data you have, no matter how many years of experience, the atmosphere is always capable of surprising you. Meanwhile, the town of El Reno began the long process of rebuilding. The tornado had damaged or destroyed more than 100 homes. It had ripped through a mobile home park, scattering trailers like toys. But the community came together. Neighbors helped neighbors. Churches opened their doors to shelter the displaced. The Red Cross set up a relief center, and slowly the physical scars began to heal. But the psychological scars were deeper. People who had survived the tornado reported nightmares, anxiety, and a constant sense of unease when the sky turned dark. The high school, which had been used as a shelter during the storm, became a focal point for recovery. Counselors were brought in to talk to students who had seen things no child should ever see. The tornado had not just destroyed buildings, it had destroyed a sense of safety. One of the most haunting stories from El Reno is that of a family who had just moved into a new house the day before the storm. They had no time to unpack. They had no time to find a safe room. When the tornado came, they huddled in a bathroom, holding their children close. The roof was ripped off. The walls collapsed. But they survived, buried under debris, waiting for rescue. When the first responders finally reached them, they found the mother shielding her children with her own body. She was bleeding, she was in shock, but she was alive. And her children were alive. That image of survival, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the face of unimaginable force, is part of the El Reno story too. As the years passed, the scientific community continued to study the data from that day. The mobile radar units had captured an unprecedented amount of information. Researchers at the University of Oklahoma, the National Severe Storms Laboratory, and the Cooperative Institute for Mesoscale Meteorological Studies spent countless hours analyzing the winds, the debris signatures, and the storm structure. They discovered that the El Reno tornado had contained multiple subvortices, some of which were spinning at nearly 300 miles per hour. These subvortices were not just features of the tornado. They were separate, violent whirls within the larger circulation. They could form and dissipate in seconds. They could move in directions that were completely independent of the main funnel. This kind of behavior had been theorized before, but never documented in such detail. El Reno became a case study for how complex tornadoes can be. The findings also changed the way the National Weather Service issues tornado warnings. Before El Reno, warnings were typically issued for a polygon-shaped area, representing the expected path of the storm. After El Reno, forecasters began incorporating more uncertainty into those polygons, expanding them to account for sudden directional changes. They also started using more explicit language, such as "this is a particularly dangerous situation" or "seek shelter immediately. This storm has a history of producing violent tornadoes." The goal was to make people take the warnings more seriously. But the challenge remained: how do you warn people when a tornado is invisible, when it is hiding behind a wall of rain, when it can change direction in an instant? There is no perfect solution. There is only vigilance. The legacy of Tim Samaras lives on in the work of his colleagues and in the instruments he designed. His company, Applied Research Associates continues to develop probes that are deployed in the path of tornadoes. These probes, known as Hardened In Situ Tornado Pressure Recorders, or HITPRs, are designed to survive the extreme forces inside a tornado and transmit data in real time. The probe that Tim was trying to deploy on May 31st was never recovered, but others have been deployed successfully in subsequent storms. And each deployment brings scientists closer to understanding the physics of tornado genesis and maintenance. Tim Samara's did not die in vain. His quest for knowledge continues. The Reno tornado also prompted a re-examination of how we define tornado intensity. The enhanced Fujita scale relies on damage indicators to estimate wind speeds, but Reno showed that a tornado can have extreme winds at altitude without producing corresponding damage on the ground. This means that the EF scale might underestimate the true power of some tornadoes. Meteorologists have debated whether to create a separate category for tornadoes that are wide and fast-moving, or whether to incorporate radar-estimated winds into the official ratings. So far, no changes have been made, but the debate continues, and every new tornado season brings new data to consider. For the people of El Reno, the tornado of 2013 is not just a scientific curiosity. It is a part of their history, a defining moment that will be passed down to future generations. Every May 31st, there is a small ceremony at the town hall. Names are read, tears are shed, and the community remembers. They remember the 8 people who died. They remember the hundreds who were injured. They remember the houses that were flattened and the lives that were upended. But they also remember the kindness of strangers, the generosity of neighbors, and the resilience of a town that refused to be broken. In the broader narrative of severe weather, the El Reno tornado occupies a unique place. It is the widest tornado ever recorded, but it is not the deadliest. It is a storm that killed 8 people, but it could have killed hundreds. It is a storm that shattered records and shattered assumptions. And it is a storm that continues to teach us years later that we are still students of the atmosphere. Every new radar scan, every new computer model, every new observation brings us closer to understanding tornadoes. But the El Reno tornado reminds us that we are not there yet. We are still learning, we are still humbled. And so as we look back on that day, we should not just see a tragedy, we should see a turning point. A moment when the storm-chasing community said we need to be better. A moment when the scientific community said we need to ask harder questions. A moment when the residents of El Reno said we will rebuild. And they did. They rebuilt their homes, their schools, their lives. And they did it knowing that the sky could turn dark again at any moment. That is the lesson of El Reno, not that nature is cruel, but that it is indifferent, and that our only choice is to adapt, to learn, and to survive. The sun sets on the plains of Oklahoma every evening, and every evening the sky puts on a show. Sometimes it is peaceful, sometimes it is violent, and sometimes, though rarely, it produces something that defies description. The El Reno tornado of May 31st, 2013 was one of those rare things. It will never be forgotten. It will never be fully understood, and it will never stop teaching us. The widest tornado in history is not just a record, it is a reminder. A reminder that no matter how much we think we know, nature always has another secret to reveal. And we can only hope that we are ready when it does. And we can only hope that we are ready when it does. But the question that lingers, the one that keeps meteorologists awake at night, is whether anyone can truly be ready for a storm like El Reno. In the years following that May afternoon, the researchers at the National Severe Storms Laboratory and the University of Oklahoma turned their attention to a new challenge: how to detect the invisible tornado. They began experimenting with phased array radar, a technology that can scan the sky in seconds rather than minutes. Traditional Doppler radar takes about 4 to 6 minutes to complete a full volume scan of the atmosphere. In that window, a tornado can form, move, and change direction. With phased array, the scan time drops to under a minute, sometimes as fast as 30 seconds. That rapid update cycle meant that forecasters could see the birth of a mesocyclone, the rotation that precedes a tornado, almost as it happened. They could track the small subvortices that made El Reno so dangerous. But the technology was expensive and it was still in the testing phase. It would be years before it could be deployed nationwide. And even then, it would only be as good as the interpretation of its data. The human element remained the weakest link. Storm chasers, who had once been a small community of scientists and hobbyists, had grown into a crowd. By 2013, the rise of social media and live streaming had turned chasing into a spectator sport. Thousands of people, many with no formal training, would drive into the plains whenever a severe weather outbreak was forecast. They would clog the roads, block emergency vehicles, and create a chaotic environment that made it harder for trained meteorologists to do their work. After El Reno, the National Weather Service and the Storm Prediction Center issued guidelines for safe chasing, but they had no authority to enforce them. Some states considered legislation to regulate storm chasers, but the laws were difficult to draft and even harder to enforce. The right to film a tornado from a public road was protected by the First Amendment, and so the chaos continued. Every spring, the highways of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas became a rolling carnival of pickup trucks with radar dishes, sedans with dashboard cameras, and RVs with satellite dishes. They all wanted a piece of the storm, and they all believed they knew what they were doing. But the Reno tornado had shown that even the experts could be caught off guard. Tim Samaras had been a legend in the chasing community. He had deployed probes in the path of dozens of tornadoes. He had survived close calls. He had been called the most cautious man in the business. And yet on May 31, 2013, he made a decision that cost him his life. In the aftermath, the chasing community engaged in a painful self-examination. They asked themselves, why did Tim die? Was it because he was trying to get too close? Was it because the storm was unpredictable? Was it because the roads were poor? The answer was all of the above. And the answer was none of the above. Because sometimes, no matter how careful you are, the tornado wins. That is a hard truth to accept for people who spend their lives trying to understand and anticipate these storms. It is a truth that is written in the rubble of every town that has been hit, in the faces of every survivor. And it is a truth that the storm chasers carry with them every time they drive into a supercell. In the years since Reno, a new generation of chasers has emerged. They were children in 2013, maybe teenagers, watching the videos online, reading the reports, feeling the awe and the horror. They grew up knowing that chasing was dangerous. They grew up knowing that even the best could fall. And yet they still felt the pull. They still wanted to see the storm. They still wanted to feel the electricity in the air, the pressure drop, the moment when the sky turns green and the world goes silent. They wanted to understand what Tim Samaras had understood, that there is a beauty in the violence, a logic in the chaos, and they wanted to do it better. They studied meteorology. They learned how to read radar. They practiced navigation on the back roads. They formed teams with clear roles and communication protocols. They respected the storm, and they respected the limits of their own skill. But they also knew that no amount of preparation could eliminate the risk. They just accepted it. The scientific community, too, has continued to evolve. In 2015, the Vortex SE program was launched to study tornadoes in the southeastern United States, a region that experiences a different kind of tornado threat, often at night, often in hilly terrain that makes radar detection difficult. The lessons from Reno were applied directly to that research. The mobile radar units that had been deployed on May 31st were upgraded. New probes were designed with better crash protection and faster data transmission. Computer models were refined to simulate the behavior of subvortices, and a new understanding emerged of how tornadoes interact with the ground, how the friction of the earth can create small whirls within the main circulation, how the debris itself can affect the wind field. It was a slow, incremental process, but every new study added a piece to the puzzle. One of the most significant advances came in the realm of forecast communication. Before Reno, the National Weather Service had already begun experimenting with impact-based warnings, a way of telling the public not just what was happening, but what they should do. For example, instead of saying, a tornado warning is in effect for Reno until 6:15 p.m., the new warnings would say, this is a particularly dangerous situation. A confirmed tornado is on the ground near Reno, moving east at 30 miles per hour. If you are in the path of this storm, take cover immediately. This tornado has a history of producing extreme damage. The language was direct, sometimes even alarming. But it was designed to cut through the noise, to make people understand that this was not a drill. After Reno, the National Weather Service expanded the use of these impact-based warnings to all tornado and severe thunderstorm events. They also began issuing experimental warnings that included the expected time of arrival at specific locations, down to the minute. The goal was to give people a sense of urgency without causing panic. It was a delicate balance, and it is still being refined. But the most profound change was in the way people thought about tornadoes. For decades, the conventional wisdom had been that a tornado is a relatively simple object, a funnel cloud that rotates violently and moves in a straight line. Reno shattered that image. The tornado that day was not a single vortex. It was a complex of multiple vortices, each one spinning at incredible speed, each one capable of moving in its own direction. The main funnel was so wide that it was easy to mistake it for a rain shaft. The subvortices, some no more than a few hundred feet across, were the real killers. They could form and dissipate in seconds. They could loop back on themselves. They could strike from a different direction than the parent circulation. This kind of behavior had been observed before in the 1999 Bridge Creekmore tornado and in other large events, but never with such clarity. Reno provided the data that confirmed the theories. It also provided a warning: do not trust the appearance of the storm. What you see is not what you get. For the people of El Reno, the tornado is not a theory. It is a memory that lives in their bones. They remember the sound, a low rumble that grew into a roar, a sound like a freight train but deeper, more resonant, like the earth itself was groaning. They remember the pressure, the way the air felt heavy and thick, the way their ears popped. They remember the dark, the sudden blackness that fell even though it was only early evening. They remember the rain, how it came horizontal, how it felt like needles on their skin. And they remember the silence after, the eerie quiet that followed the roar, broken only by the sound of sirens and crying and the occasional crack of a broken beam settling. One story from that day has become a touchstone for the community. It is the story of a young woman named Jessica who was driving home from work when the tornado warning came. She was on Route 66 just east of El Reno when she saw the cloud. It was not the classic wedge shape she had seen in photographs. It was a low, broad mass like a wall of smoke. She thought it was a rain shaft, but then she saw the debris, pieces of wood and metal spinning in the air, and she knew. She pulled her car to the side of the road and ran for the nearest building, a small church. The doors were locked. She pounded on them, no one answered. She looked around. There was nowhere else to go. The tornado was maybe a mile away, but it was moving fast. She ran back to her car and lay on the floor, covering her head with her hands. She prayed. She did not know what else to do. The tornado passed a quarter-mile to the north, close enough that she could feel the car shake, close enough that she could hear the roar. When it was over, she got out. The church was still standing, the doors were still locked, but on the porch there was a note. It said, "Sorry we were in the basement, God bless you." She still has that note framed on her mantelpiece. It reminds her that even in the worst moments there is kindness. That kindness spread beyond El Reno. In the days after the tornado, donations poured in from across the country. Truckloads of water, food, and clothing arrived. Volunteers came from neighboring towns, from states far away, to help with the cleanup. The American Red Cross set up a shelter at the high school. The Salvation Army served meals. The local churches organized distribution centers. The community held fundraisers, bake sales, car washes. The money raised helped families replace what they had lost. But more than the money, it was the presence of strangers that mattered. People who had never been to El Reno drove hours to hand out supplies, to listen, to hug. They reminded the survivors that they were not alone. They reminded them that the world still cared, but the scars remained. The tornado had killed 8 people directly, but it had also left invisible wounds. Some survivors developed post-traumatic stress disorder. They could not sleep. They could not drive in the rain. They could not look at the sky without feeling a knot in their stomachs. Children who had lived through the storm had nightmares for years. The high school, which had been used as a shelter, became a source of anxiety for some students. They associated it with the terror of that day. The school brought in counselors. They held group therapy sessions. They allowed students to talk about their experiences. It helped, but it did not heal everything. Some wounds are too deep, some memories are too sharp, and yet the town rebuilt. The houses were reconstructed, this time with safe rooms, with reinforced walls, with roofs that could withstand higher winds. The mobile home park that had been destroyed was converted into a green space, a park with a playground and a memorial. The names of the 8 victims are engraved on a granite stone. Every year on May 31st, there is a ceremony. People gather, they light candles, they read the names, they share stories, they cry, and then they go home and they continue living. Because that is what they do, they live. The scientific legacy of El Reno continues to shape the field of meteorology. The data from that day is used in classrooms across the country. Students study the radar loops, the damage surveys, the video footage. They learn about the mill can now only use a small number of experiments that change the understanding of tornadoes. They ask questions that have no easy answers. Why did the tornado suddenly expand to 2.6 miles wide? Why did the subvortices move erratically? Could it happen again? The answer to that last question is yes. It could happen again. It might happen again. The conditions that produced the El Reno tornado, a moist warm front interacting with a dry line, a strong low-level jet stream, ample instability, are not rare on the southern plains. They occur every spring. The ingredients were not unusual. The outcome was. And that is what makes the study of tornadoes so challenging and so essential. We cannot prevent them. We can only predict and prepare, and prediction is still an imperfect science. In 2019, the National Weather Service installed a new dual polarization radar in El Reno itself. The radar stands on a hill outside town, its white dome visible for miles. It provides high-resolution data to forecasters in Norman. It also serves as a symbol. The town that was hit by the widest tornado in history now has one of the most advanced radar systems in the country. It is a fitting tribute. It is also a practical tool. Every time a storm forms in that part of Oklahoma, the radar beams pulse into the sky, searching for rotation, searching for debris, searching for the next threat. The meteorologists in the Norman office watch the screens, waiting for the telltale signs. They know that they are better equipped than they were in 2003. They know that they have more data, better models, faster computers. But they also know that nature is unpredictable. They know that there is always the possibility of a storm that defies the models, that spins up faster than expected, that moves in ways that are not anticipated. They know that the only certainty is uncertainty. And so the work continues. The researchers at the National Severe Storms Laboratory run simulations of tornado formation, trying to understand the precise combination of wind shear, moisture, and instability that leads to a violent tornado. They deploy instruments into storms, sometimes using unmanned aircraft, sometimes using ground vehicles. They analyze every piece of data from every tornado that occurs, looking for patterns. The Reno Tornado is a constant reference point. It is the gold standard of complexity. Every new tornado is compared to it. Every new discovery is measured against it. It is a benchmark, a reminder of how much we still have to learn. For the families of the 8 victims, the tornado is not a benchmark. It is a loss. It is a hole in their lives that can never be filled. They remember the last words, the last hugs, the last goodbyes. They remember the phone calls that went unanswered. They remember the waiting, the hours of not knowing. They remember the news that came too late. They remember the funerals. They remember the anniversaries. They remember the birthdays. They remember the empty chairs. And yet many of them have chosen to stay in Reno. They could have moved, they could have started over somewhere else, but they stayed because this is home, because the town is not just the tornado, it is the people, it is the community. It is the shared memory of that day and the shared determination to move forward. They stay because they know that they are not defined by the worst thing that happened to them. They are defined by how they responded. And so, as the sun sets over the plains, as the radar dome glows orange in the fading light, the people of Reno go about their lives. They work, they play, they raise their children. They watch the weather forecast with a little more attention than they used to. They know that the sky holds secrets. They know that they have been humbled. But they also know that they have survived. And that is enough. That is everything. The stories of that day did not end when the tornado dissipated. They lived on in the testimonies of the survivors, in the reports of the meteorologists, and in the quiet acts of resilience that unfolded in the weeks and months that followed. One such story belongs to a man named Richard, a volunteer firefighter who had responded to the first reports of damage. He had been at the station when the sirens went off and he had driven toward the storm, not away from it. He knew the risks. He had seen tornadoes before, but nothing prepared him for what he found when he reached the area where the mobile home park had stood. The debris field stretched for miles. Trailers were crumpled like aluminum cans. Trees were stripped of bark. Cars were twisted into metal ribbons, and in the midst of that chaos, he found a woman who had been thrown from her home. She was alive, but barely. He carried her to his truck and drove her to the hospital, dodging power lines and overturned vehicles. She survived. He never knew her name, but he remembers the weight of her body, the feel of her blood on his hands. He still has nightmares. He still drives past that spot and slows down. He still checks the sky on every stormy day. He is not alone. Many of the first responders from that day were changed. They had seen things that could not be unseen. They had pulled bodies from rubble. They had comforted children who had lost their parents. They had worked for hours without rest, without food, without water. And when the work was done, they went home to their own families, their own homes, their own fears. Some of them left the fire department. Some of them sought counseling. Some of them found solace in talking to each other. They formed a bond that was forged in the worst of circumstances. They still meet every year on May 31st, not to commemorate the tornado, but to check on each other. They sit in a coffee shop in downtown Reno and they talk about everything except that day. They talk about their kids, their jobs, their gardens. They laugh, they argue about sports, they order pie, and when they leave, they shake hands, sometimes hug, and they say, "See you next year." It is a simple ritual, but it holds them together. The town itself also found ways to heal. The memorial park with its granite stone and its playground became a gathering place. Children played on the swings while parents sat on benches nearby, reading the names of the victims. The park was designed not just to remember, but to reclaim joy. The playground was built with donations from a children's charity in another state. It had bright colors, soft surfaces, and slides that twisted and turned. The sound of laughter filled the air. It was a sound that had been absent for a long time. The town had lost its innocence, but it was learning to live again. The scientific community, meanwhile, continued to dissect every detail of the Reno tornado. One of the most puzzling aspects was the sudden expansion of the vortex from a quarter-mile wide to 2.6 miles wide in a matter of minutes. How did that happen? Researchers at the University of Oklahoma and the National Severe Storms Laboratory spent years studying the radar data. They built computer models that simulated the interaction between the tornado and the surrounding environment. They discovered that the expansion was likely caused by a process called vortex breakdown. When the tornado reached a certain intensity, the core of the vortex became unstable. The air in the center was torn apart by forces that could not be sustained. The tornado essentially collapsed inward and then ballooned outward, creating a massive, weak circulation that still contained deadly subvortices. It was like a star that implodes and then explodes. The analogy was imperfect, but it captured the violent beauty of the event. This discovery had practical implications. It meant that tornadoes could change structure rapidly without warning. It meant that the width of a tornado could mislead forecasters and the public. A wide tornado might look less intense, but it could still be carrying smaller, violent vortices that were invisible to the naked eye. The Reno tornado had been a textbook example of this danger. Many of the people who died were caught by these subvortices, which moved at speeds up to 175 miles per hour and changed direction abruptly. One victim was a storm chaser named Tim Samaras, who had been a pioneer in tornado research. He had deployed probes in the path of tornadoes for years, and he had never been killed. But on that day, the subvortex that hit his car was moving faster than anything he had ever encountered. He did not stand a chance. His death was a reminder that even the most experienced chasers could be humbled by the storm. In the wake of that tragedy, the storm-chasing community went through a period of reflection. There had long been an unwritten code of conduct among chasers, but it was not always followed. Some chasers drove recklessly. Some chased purely for profit or fame. The Reno tornado exposed the risks of that behavior. The same storm that killed Tim Samaras also killed two other chasers, Carl Young and Paul Samaras, Tim's son. They were not thrill seekers, they were scientists. Their deaths sparked new conversations about safety, responsibility, and the ethics of chasing. The National Weather Service began to issue stronger warnings about the dangers of chasing tornadoes. Some states considered legislation to restrict access to storm intercept vehicles. The debate continues to this day, but the most profound change was in the way tornado warnings were communicated. Before Reno, the National Weather Service had a system called storm-based warnings, which were issued for specific counties or parts of counties. The warnings included information about the storm's location, speed, and direction, but they did not always convey the severity of the threat. After Reno, the Weather Service introduced impact-based warnings, which used more descriptive language to convey the potential danger. A warning could now say, "This is a particularly dangerous situation." A large, extremely dangerous tornado is on the ground. Seek shelter immediately. The goal was to avoid the kind of confusion that had occurred on May 31, 2013, when some people did not take the warning seriously because they could not see the tornado. The language was designed to break through the numbness, to create a sense of urgency that could save lives. The impact of these changes was felt across the country. In following years, tornado warnings became more specific, more urgent, and more likely to be heeded. Studies showed that the number of people who took shelter when a tornado warning was issued increased significantly. The success was not complete. There were still false alarms. There were still storms that moved too fast for a warning to be effective. But the direction was clear. Better communication meant better survival rates. And that was a legacy worth celebrating. Yet for all the progress, the fundamental challenge remained. Tornadoes are still unpredictable. The Reno tornado was a once-in-a-lifetime event, but it was not a fluke. It was a product of the atmospheric conditions that exist on the southern plains every spring. The ingredients were in place. The storm just happened to find the perfect alignment, and that means that a tornado of similar size and intensity could happen again. It could happen in a different place at a different time under slightly different conditions. It could happen in a densely populated area like Dallas or Oklahoma City. The thought is sobering. The people of Reno know this better than anyone. They live with that knowledge every day. They have built safe rooms. They have made plans. They have taught their children what to do when the sirens sound. They have learned to read the sky in a way that outsiders cannot understand. They can spot the signs of rotation in a cloud, the way the air seems to tighten, the eerie stillness that precedes the storm. They are not afraid, they are prepared, and that is the only defense we have against the power of nature. As the years pass, the memory of the Reno tornado begins to fade for those who were not there. The town has changed. New families have moved in. The scars have healed, at least on the surface. But for those who lived through it, the memory is as sharp as the day it happened. They can still hear the roar. They can still feel the vibration in the ground. They can still smell the air after the storm, the mix of rain, mud, and broken wood. They can still see the faces of the people they lost, and they can still feel the grip of fear that tightened around their hearts. But they also remember the kindness. They remember the stranger who handed them a bottle of water. They remember the neighbor who helped them board up their windows. They remember the donations, the prayers, the hugs. They remember that in the midst of the worst, they were not alone. And that memory is stronger than the fear. It is what allows them to look at the sky without flinching. It is what allows them to walk through the memorial park without breaking down. It is what allows them to keep living. And so the story of the Reno tornado is not just a story of destruction. It is a story of survival. It is a story of science and service, of grief and grace. It is a story that reminds us that we are small in the face of nature, but we are also strong. We are capable of rebuilding, we are capable of learning, we are capable of loving, and that is what makes us human. As the final light fades over the Oklahoma plains, the radar dome glows like a beacon. The meteorologists inside watch the screens, their eyes scanning for the first signs of rotation. They know that the next storm could come at any time. They know that they are ready. And they know that no matter what comes, the people of Reno will face it together. Because that is what they do. They survive, they endure, they thrive. And they remember. And so the legacy of the Reno tornado is a kind of mirror. It reflects our best and worst selves. It shows us how fragile we are and how resilient we can be. It teaches us that the most powerful storms are not just meteorological events, they are human events. They test our systems, our bonds, and our courage. In the years since that day, the National Weather Service has continued to refine its warning strategies. Meteorologists have developed new tools to detect subvortices, the hidden killers that claimed lives on that highway. Mobile radar units are more common now. Chasers carry better equipment, and many have adopted new safety protocols. The culture of storm chasing has changed, slowly, unevenly, but meaningfully. There is a greater emphasis on respect for the storm, for the public, and for the families who are watching from home. But the science of tornadoes is still incomplete. There are questions that remain unanswered. Why did the Reno tornado expand so dramatically? Why did it maintain such a complex structure for so long? Could it have been predicted with enough lead time to save every life? These questions drive research forward. At the National Severe Storms Laboratory, scientists continue to analyze the data from that day, hoping to find patterns that will improve forecasts. They study the way tornadoes interact with the ground, with buildings, with the very air they breathe. They know that the next big storm could be different, but they also know that the lessons from Reno are universal. For the people of Reno, life goes on. The town has new storm shelters. The schools have new protocols. The sirens are tested every Saturday at noon, but no amount of preparation can erase the memory of that day. Some survivors still flinch when the sky turns green. Some still wake in the night to the sound of wind. They carry a weight that others cannot see. Yet they also carry a strength that comes from walking through fire and not being consumed. They have become a community of quiet survivors bound together by a shared experience that outsiders will never fully understand. And in that shared experience, there is a kind of wisdom. It is the wisdom of knowing that nature is not our enemy. It is simply indifferent. The tornado does not hate us. It does not love us. It is a force of physics, a blend of pressure and temperature and moisture that sometimes aligns in ways that defy comprehension. But our response to that force defines who we are. We can choose to be afraid, or we can choose to be prepared. We can choose to be helpless, or we can choose to help each other. In the end, the Reno tornado is not just a chapter in weather history. It is a reminder that we live in a world that is beautiful and dangerous, a world that can give us life and take it away in the same breath. It is a reminder that the sky above the plains is not empty. It is full of energy and possibility, of beauty and terror. And it is a reminder that when the storm comes, we have each other. The radar screen flickers. The meteorologist takes a sip of cold coffee and adjusts his chair. It is spring again in Oklahoma. The air is warm and thick. The wind is shifting. He looks at the clock. It is almost time for the evening briefing. He knows that the conditions are not perfect today, but he also knows that perfect conditions can appear without warning. He remembers May 31st, 2013. He remembers the call, the chaos, the aftermath. He remembers the faces. He does not let the memory paralyze him. He lets it guide him. He sits forward, ready for whatever comes next. Because that is what we do. We watch, we warn, we remember, and we survive. That is the story of the Reno tornado, and that is the story of every storm that has ever touched the ground. The wind may fade, the sky may clear, but the lesson endures. We are small, but we are not alone. And that is enough.